I really like the second book of the Maccabees much better than the first, even though it's not as good a historical work. It's more, you know, I mean, the first one's okay, but you get the feeling in that presentation of Simon, it's not, I would say, corrupt, but it obviously it's written from the point of view of Simon's rise to power. I think it's a fair picture of Judas. Probably more fair than Maccabees 2 in the sense it doesn't over-idealize him, and it gives his achievements, and it tells about his death, and looks like he was pretty popular. I don't think there's any indication, as I said, that he usurped anything. And certainly now these people are not usurping anything, the brothers, because they're getting official appointments. Why am I worried about that? Because Cross says in his book that the Maccabees usurped the high priesthood. So when someone says at Harvard that Judas Maccabee and the Maccabees usurped the high priesthood, that becomes almost gospel for several generations. And that's what I'm trying to combat. There's no indication that that's the case. And in fact, the opposite looks like the case. So he's a popular high priest, and he certainly is functioning as a high priest. And in fact, Josephus will tell us Judas was elected to the high priesthood twice. That's in the Antiquities, and by the people. It's not in either of the Maccabee books as such, but that's the impression that you get. Okay, so now we have the second book. Chapter 2, we find in the archives of the prophet Jeremiah about the Ark of the Covenant, about how there's a book called the Memoirs of Nehemiah, chapter line 13, and how Judas collected the copies of the Bible as we now have it, which they're willing to send. This is the story of Judas Maccabee, line 19, and his brothers, chapter 2. The dedication of the altar, and this is why this book is looked down upon a bit, because of the manifestations from heavenly horsemen, and so it's not strictly speaking a straight history. And of course, those people brought up on the New Testament background wouldn't consider this a defect, but scholars in universities, I think, probably do consider it in academic circles a defect, and therefore Maccabees 2 is little regarded. But I think Maccabees 2 has its only interest in Judas, and it's honest about things. Like in line 23, it says that it took its material from the 5 books of Jason of Cyrene and digested it. Well, that's honest. So it gives you its source. So this is before all the trouble began, and so on and so forth. So we get a lot of infighting here, a lot of trouble. And then we get some Seleucid intervention. This is before Antiochus Epiphanes. And then this representative of the king, someone line 13, called Heliodorus, comes. And he wants to raid the temple treasury. And everyone is horrified by this. 24, he gets to the treasury here. And then in the middle of all this, a heavenly horseman appears. So this is not straight history, probably. Rearing violently, it struck Heliodorus with its 4 feet, line 25. The rider was accoutred entirely in gold, and 2 other young men of beautiful strength and beauty, magnificently apparelled, took him and flogged him unremittingly. Well, you see, we've gotten enthusiastic here. This is Sir Galahad. Galahad has appeared on the scene. Sir Lancelot and King Arthur and the whole bunch. But this is clearly angelic figures, but not our idea of angels with wings and halos and stuff. These angels have armor. And so, and they say, ask Onias, line 31, to forgive you and give you life. So it's a kind of resurrection a la Jesus Christ later on here. And so he doesn't die, or he's resurrected, one of the two. And be grateful to Onias the high priest, 33, since it's for his sake the Lord has granted you your life. So this is a kind of Onias the righteous, if you want to call him that. So you see, he plays the role of who in Maccabees 1? Mattathias. Now this is the previous priesthood here. The previous priesthood up till the time of all this problem. This same Simon, though, is making trouble in chapter 4, and he slandered Onias further. And he had the effrontery to name this benefactor of the city, this protector of his fellow countrymen, this zealot for the law. So he's Onias is a zealot, he's a proper zealot high priest. Now here is usurpation. His brother Jason, 7, usurps the high priesthood from him. Like Alchemus in the other book, he is, line 13, a godless wretch. Because he was not righteous and pious, he's no true high priest, but there were no bounds to his impiety. And another guy, after 3 years, the brother of Simon comes, called Menelaus. They all have these Greek names. He has backing from the Seleucids too. Everyone seems to get backing from these Seleucids. And he gets a hold of the high priesthood. And Onias finally is taken captive to Antioch and murdered, line 33. So he's martyred. So this all happens before the Judas Maccabee stuff. Then we have infighting between these other priests, Menelaus, Jacob, and then Antiochus Epiphanes finally appears in line 11 of chapter 5. And Menelaus is the priest that's cooperating with him. This traitor to the law, 15. Acted as his guide, so he was in cahoots with Antiochus. He's the ones who the Maccabee books are condemning at the beginning, remember? These backsliders and renegades who cooperate with foreign power and so on. But what do these people seem to be mostly after when they come to Jerusalem? Plunder the temple, the temple treasure. And now, as we saw last time or previously, Judas Maccabee is introduced in 527. Then Judas, called Maccabeus, with 9 others, withdrew into the wilderness and lived like wild animals in the hills with his companions, eating nothing but wild plants to avoid contracting defilement. And he's a John the Baptist type. And interestingly enough, look, there are 9 others. So in any case, altogether they make about 10. And that could be the idea of the 10 just men. You know, when in Genesis, when Abraham bargains with the angel, or who turns out to be God, for the saving of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, it gets down to how many men will he save a city for?
10.
For the sake of 10 just men, he would withhold destruction from the city. I think that's why this is said, the 10 just men. Now, the martyrdom episode. It starts in line 18. First, you get the people who won't defend themselves on the Sabbath. That's around line 11. And then line 18, Eliezer. The reason I like my Bible, it's so well laid out that it has all the headings, exactly what's going on in each section. It's not divided down the middle. I've gone to use bookstores. They have concordances. They always have 1 or 2 of these old Jerusalem Bibles there. If you see one, grab it, because they're really worth it for teaching and study purposes. Eliezer, one of the foremost teachers of the law, line 18, very old, noble appearance. They tried to make him eat pig flesh. And just as the Christian martyrs later are presented as willing to die for their faith and so on, here, it's already preceded by these martyrs here. And the issue here is not being willing to eat forbidden food. Anyway, he resolved to die with honor. This book is encouraging what? Even more than Maccabees 1, martyrdom. Rather than be corrupted, polluted, willing to cooperate with foreign. And this will be followed by the 7 brothers that I think is parodied in the Gospels, and when it's about resurrection of the dead, when Jesus is asked, if one brother dies and the next brother gets his wife and the next brother dies and that's totally parodying this episode here about resurrection of the dead and the 7 brothers. And they're laughing at Jewish marital laws that the brothers can marry their brothers' wives if they haven't had children or something. The people who wrote it knew that they were being nasty. And which of the brothers will she be married to in the resurrection? It's just, anyway, this book wants resurrection, and he was 90, but he would not conform to the foreigner's way of life, line 25. He would not be led astray. Therefore, line 27, if I am man enough to quit this life here and now, I shall prove myself worthy of my old age. I shall have left the young a noble example of how to make a good death. There it is. Eagerly and generously for the venerable and holy laws. That is the ethos of this book. That is the ethos of the Maccabean movement at this point, and that is the thing that Paul is going against when he's trying to attack this ethos. So this is like, you couldn't be more anti-Paul than this book. Then chapter 7, the 7 brothers. So again, they're 7 brothers, and they want to make them eat pig flesh. We are prepared to die rather than break the laws of our forefathers, lines 3 and 4. The king, whoever he is really furious. Antiochus Epiphanes, I guess. And he gets a big fire going, and he's going to burn them alive in a pan, while his brothers looked on, and he was rendered helpless, and the smoke of the pan drifted to the mother. But she encouraged each one after the other. See, this is even the mother. The mom says to him, "Die nobly. The Lord God is watching, and he will pity us. As in the psalm that Moses bore witness against the people to their face, proclaiming God would pity his servants. So the first left the world. Then they took the second. Will you eat before your body is tortured limb by limb?" And he retorted in the tongue of his forefathers, "Never." And he too was tortured. And in his last breath he said, "Inhuman fiend, you may discharge us from the present life, but the King of the world will raise us up, since it is for his laws that we die, to live again forever." There you have it. Combine this with Daniel and you've got the whole martyrdom, resurrection ethic. Die for the law, you will be resurrected. He's killed. The third is brought, and he died. And then the fourth, ours is the better choice, to meet death at men's hands. Yet relying on God's promise, we shall be raised up by him. Whereas for you, there will be no resurrection, no new life. Now you see how Maccabees 2 differs from Daniel. Daniel pictures a resurrection of kind of like a heaven and hell. But Maccabees 2, only the righteous are resurrected, particularly the martyred righteous. The rest just stay dead. And that goes into the Christian, if you want to call it Christian, I'm not sure it is yet, idea of who goes into the kingdom. The righteous living and the righteous dead, because the righteous living are going to go into the kingdom because they're not going to die. The only people who have to die to get to the kingdom are the people who already are dead. We just want to get them in too, so we got to resurrect them. I don't know where they got this idea, but it's coming in at this point. So then the 5th, and then the 6th, you're making war on God. But the mother in the 7th is now, it's like Mary, mother of Jesus. She's especially worthy, the mother of these 7 brothers. I don't know how you appeared in my womb. I did not give you breath and life. I had not the shaping of every part of you. It's the creator of the world that ordained the process of man's birth and presided over the origin of all things, who in his mercy, line 23, will most surely give you back your breath and life, seeing that you now despise your own existence for the sake of his law. So you're going to get, because of the law, if you die for the law, you will be resurrected. Antiochus is laughing at this. "My son, pity me. Don't pity me because you're dying. Pity me and die nobly. I carried you 9 months in my womb. I suckled you 3 years." Didn't have bottles and formula. That's a pretty hard work, 3 years, huh? "Reared you to the age you are now. I implore you, child, observe heaven and earth. Consider all that is in them. Acknowledge God made them out of," look at this, "out of what did not exist." So we even have an advanced philosophical concept here. Creatio ex nihilo. It's a philosophical concept that was known in the late Middle Ages, and it's already known here. Creation out of nothing. We think of it as a really more recent idea. It's already back in this 2nd century BC period. And mankind the same way. Do not fear the executioner. Prove yourself worthy of your brothers. So in the day of mercy, the day of the resurrection, I may receive you back again in your brother's company. Now, that also, to my mind, if you read this carefully, explains the Masada suicide, the reason they chose suicide, that was better than surrendering and being corrupted, taken to Rome, being used as a prostitute or some other such thing. And how do I know this? Because in this Masada place where this mass suicide occurred in the Roman war, the bones passage from Ezekiel is buried under the synagogue floor there. So that showed they believed in the resurrection of the dead, like the bones of Ezekiel. And the reason is right here in this book. Now, the boy says, 37, I too, like my brother, surrender my body and life for the laws of my ancestors. And the king was fell into rage, and the last brother met his end, undefiled, uncorrupted, unpolluted. And in the New Testament, we have Jesus talking about what goes into the mouth cannot pollute the man. Only what goes out of the mouth. What goes into the mouth goes down the throat, into the belly, and out the toilet drain. He said this, declaring all foods clean, says the Gospel of Mark. So, you have to range this against this. Who's writing the Gospel of Mark? Who's saying those things? Who is it, Jesus, or someone putting words into Jesus' mouth? Is that going to fly in Palestine against this, in this atmosphere of 2 centuries? Of course not. It can only fly in Rome. It can only fly in Greece, or Asia Minor, or Alexandria. Someone in those cities is writing it. It's not the Messiah in Palestine. But they're saying this is the Messiah in Palestine. No, no. Messiah in Palestine, to be a popular Messiah, has got to represent these ideas. Skip it. Judas the Maccabees, then chapter 8, went around the country secretly. He had about 6,000 followers. And he called upon the Lord to help him, take pity on the temple, polluted. So he's against the pollution of the temple by godless people in ruin, and so on. Antiochus Epiphanes, chapter 9, dies. Don't have time to read all this. Chapter 10, Judas purifies the temple. They offered the first sacrifice in 2 years, line 10:3. This is the day of the purification of the temple, profaned by foreigners. Again, it's anti-foreign, you see. 25th day of Kislev. They shall keep 8 days rejoicing of the Feast of Tabernacles. That before the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, they have been living in mountains and caverns like wild beasts. You see, this is to commemorate Hanukkah. What most Jews have no idea is to commemorate the wilderness experience of Judas Maccabee. But not the miracle of lights. It's the wilderness experience of living in mountains and caves like John the Baptist. And they celebrated it and ratified it by vote, line 8. So this is a holiday ratified by vote by the people. More heavenly horsemen appeared, 29, when the battle was at its height. 5 magnificent horsemen appeared from heaven on gold horses with golden bridles. And they blessed God. They advanced in the battle order with the aid of the celestial ally. But that's going to be the Dead Sea Scroll. The War Scroll believes that the heavenly host is going to intervene on their behalf, and that the heavenly angels are going to be in their camps. We're going to hear that time and time again in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here is the prelude to it right here. That they believed that they were totally pure and totally without blemish or whatever, that the angels would come down and fight on their side and they could defeat the Roman Empire. Then some problem here in chapter 12, some idols, a little bit. There's a similar episode in Acts when they discover some idols under some of the followers, or some money that was stolen or whatever. In any case, Judas, as a result of all these things, urged the people, line 42, to keep themselves free of sin, seeing the effect of this on these sinful people who had lapsed into idolatry. And he took a collection from the army. And he collected 2,000 drachmas sent to Jerusalem to have a sacrifice for sin offered, an altogether fine and noble action, in which he took full account of the resurrection. For if he had not expected the fallen to rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. Whereas if he had in view the splendid recompense reserved for those who make a pious end, there's the Hasmonean movement, make a pious end. The thought was holy and devout, kiddushim. That was why this atonement sacrifice offered for the dead, so they might be released from their sins. So again, Eliezer, 7 brothers, and this, make a pious end, explained, I think, the Hasmonean movement. And then the priests are again, line 34 to 36, praying to God to help them so that the temple won't be polluted again. And here we have another martyrdom episode. Rhazes, one of the elders of the people, he denounced Nicanor. He was beloved by his fellow countrymen. Called a father of the Jews, therefore. But he was convicted in the early days of the insurrection. So again, it's the same insurrection as Alchemus did something bad in. Practicing Judaism and risked both his body and life for Judaism. Again, with the utmost zeal. I have zeal again, so another zealot episode. Nicanor sent 500 men. But Rhazes, finding himself completely surrounded, fell on his own sword, nobly resolving to die rather than... But he didn't succeed, he missed. And he went up on the wall and threw himself down among the soldiers who had come to arrest him, line 44, and blazing with anger, struggled to his feet, blood spurting out in all directions. His terrible wounds ran right through the crowd. Then taking a stand on a steep precipice, almost losing every drop of blood, he tore out his entrails, took them in both hands, flung them at the troops, calling on the master of life and spirit to give them back to him one day. Right there. So he believes also in resurrection of the dead, and he throws his guts at the foreign armies, even though he's an old man. Then we have this last episode we already did, chapter 15, where we have this help from heaven, line 8. Blah, 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 blah. Then I guess Judas wins the battle, and he hung Nicanor's head, line 35, on the citadel. Clear and evident sign to all of the help of the Lord. So here are the signs and wonders in the Old Testament. They're not exorcisms and that kind of thing. They're the battle God fights on behalf of his people. And this is the sign, defeating his enemies. And that will be in the war scroll too. Signs and wonders in the New Testament. Resurrections, curings, exorcisms, healings. It's a peaceful Hellenistic universe. In these books, Maccabean, Old Testament, signs and wonders in the Dead Sea Scrolls are these battles God fights on behalf of his people against his enemies. They all passed another unanimous vote decree to celebrate that day, the 13th day of the 12th month, and the eve of the day of Mordecai. See, it's the day before Purim, which is the day of Mordecai, if you like, Mordecai and Esther. And that's it. Next time, we're going to go through Josephus. I want to check one thing in this Maccabees 2. We got the fact that Rhazes threw his guts at the people, and he died a death of zeal for the law. And Onias and Jeremiah appear to Judas and give him the holy battle sword, if you like. And the compiler's conclusion is, and since then the city has remained in the possession of the Hebrews, and I bring my own work here to an end. Well, in fact, it didn't remain very long in the possession of the Hebrews, or whoever he means by Hebrews. The Jews, I suppose he's talking about. But it wasn't long before things started to go bad again. And we know that Judas was killed, We know that 20 more years of struggle developed with his brothers involved, and we know that his other brother, Jonathan, was killed. Let's go over to Josephus, who picks up the events from there. Now, I like to read prefaces. I have an old version of the Penguin translation of the Jewish War, but a lot can be gotten just from the preface. The War of the Jews against the Romans, and of course you'll have the old Whiston translation, which is almost medieval. The War of the Jews against the Romans was the greatest of our time, greater too perhaps than any recorded struggle, whether between cities or nations. Well, he says at another point that there's no honor in defeating second-class enemies. If you're going to get honor from a war, and this is written to honor who? The Flavians. The imperial family to be that we've already discussed. The changeover occurs right in the middle of the war when Nero is assassinated, which is 68 AD. The war begins in 66, and the Flavians take over in 68, 69, and then they continue on for another not three generations, but three representatives until the 90s, when the last Flavian, Domitian, is assassinated also. Domitian, the younger brother of Titus, is as crazy apparently or as vicious as Nero. Women and children will all be taken into slavery and things like that. You didn't get a second chance. If you showed any resistance, you were dead. The Spartacus uprising, they crucified everyone along the Appian Way from Rome to Naples. No country who could resist didn't resist. No one willingly surrendered to them. And the Jews were one of those groups that didn't have the means to really resist, but they did resist to the utmost of their ability. And I've said often enough in this class, I think it's a shame that their resistance has been turned against them and their messianic ideal has been inverted upon them to make them look like the heavies and the negative ones, when it was the messianic ideal that was moving them to this resistance. So the reason he exaggerates the greatness of this struggle is that so there'd be honor to some extent in the successful completion of it on the part of the Romans as patrons. And this is incredible. For us to have a book by somebody who actually lived through this time, was born around 38 AD, the book has survived, other works of his have survived almost intact, very little falsification seems to have crept into it. This is like an amazing thing to have documents of this kind, that we can still look at and we get a bird's eye view of this period. That's why Josephus is, with all his flaws, and I really dislike him as a person intentionally, but he is articulate, and he has a prodigious memory, almost encyclopedic. I mean, this book is just full of data, and if you add the antiquities to it, you have so much information about this period: names, places, families, people. There's no other period in history, as I've said before the period of modern printing, that we know as much about, thanks to someone like Josephus. Anyway, persons with no first-hand knowledge, I was there, I saw it. We're going to get to the Gospels. I don't have a high opinion of the Gospels. They are presented as eyewitness reports. I don't know if he saw any of those materials or if there were other similar materials, but here's what he says about that kind of thing. Persons with no first-hand knowledge, accepting baseless and inconsistent stories on the basis of hearsay, have written garbled accounts, while the eyewitnesses have been falsified. The falsification, and that's what it is either to flatter the Romans or to vilify the Jews. Now that says it all about documents emanating from this period that have survived, yet nobody pays attention to the first sentence of Josephus. You know what I think about the documents that everyone loves so much. I think that they flatter the Romans and vilify the Jews. And when you get portraits of Pontius Pilate of the kind we're familiar with, that's flattering of the Romans. When you get portraits of Herod Antipas or Herod the Tetrarch not wishing to kill John the Baptist, that's flattering Roman officials. But then Josephus doesn't. He says that he's not going to do it, and yet he goes on and does it anyway. That's how powerful it is. He flatters Titus all the time. Vespasian cried, pledged with the captives to surrender and all this sort of thing, begged them not to bring this fate upon themselves. This is nonsense. This is flattery. These people were brutal. Anyway, he says, eulogy or abuse being substituted for factual record. Again, that is so incisive. Anyone you speak to in this period or about the history of this period, read that passage to them. So for the benefit of the emperor's subjects, I have decided to translate into Greek the books which I wrote some time ago in my native language for circulation in the Middle East. I myself, Josephus, son of Matthias, or Matthias, don't forget, Matthias is the name of at least one, if not two apostles. He's the one who's elected to replace Judas Iscariot in the beginning of the book of Acts, and then you have Matthew, which is a variation on the name Matthias. So you have two apostles by that or a similar variation on that name. And a priest from Jerusalem. What does he mean I translated from my native language? I'm not sure if he means Hebrew or Aramaic, because I'm not sure what language he wrote originally in. But I am a Hebrew by race and a priest from Jerusalem. So he's both a priest and a Jew or a Hebrew. And it's important, by the way, to distinguish between Hebrew and Jew to some extent, because to be a Hebrew means you go back to the original Abrahamic tribes. I think Paul is interested in that distinction between Jew and Hebrew. I'm not sure Paul ever really calls himself a Jew. Sometimes I once he might have. But he definitely calls himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews, which means that he's trying to say he's of the tribe of Benjamin, which means that Jew means what? Of the tribe of Judah. So he's, in some sense, wiggling out of that situation of being a, quote, Jew. You say Josephus is too. He may be, though he doesn't make any claims to be of the tribe of anything but the Judean tribe. But notice, the priests were not of the tribe of Judah either, were they? They were supposedly of the tribe of what? Levi. Right. So he may be implying that too, that he is not a Jew as such, but a Levite, a priest. And a priest from Jerusalem. In the early days I fought against the Romans. In the later events I was an unwilling witness. Don't forget, in the New Testament, Jesus is the temple. And Jesus said, I will destroy the temple in 3 days and build it up again. He meant his body. And in some of the letters of Paul and in Ephesians, Jesus' body is identified with the temple. The members of the community are identified with Jesus' body in 1 Corinthians. And then in some way, the whole thing is considered to be the temple, so that when you participate in his body and blood, you're participating in the temple sacrifice ceremony. So all of those parallels exist. Why was he an unwilling witness? He was taken prisoner, right? And then he was used by the Romans as an interrogator of prisoners. And that's also where he got a lot of information from. And when it occurred, Rome herself was in the most unsettled state. Jewish revolutionaries took advantage of the general disturbances. That means the emperor, Nero and others were having trouble. They had vast resources of men and money, that is the revolutionaries. So widespread was the ferment that some were filled with hope, others with fear of loss by state of affairs in the east, for the Jews expected all their Mesopotamian brethren to join the insurrection. So he thinks that they're well financed. I imagine it came from Persia, because the Persians had been, if you read your Josephus carefully, in this area in the period right before Herod came back and restormed the temple with Roman troops. In the period of the Roman Civil War, they'd come in the 40s BC, and then they were sponsoring the Jewish royal family, and then the Romans came in with Herod and others and defeated them and took Mark Antony and others took back the Palestine area. The Romans, lost some armies fighting in the east. One of those people who was, I think, part of the plot against Julius Caesar, I think his name was Crassus or somebody. Do you remember your Julius Caesar if you've read it? He was killed in a battle in northern Syria, near the town where Abraham came from. That's how I remember Karhai, which is Haran, and all his army was destroyed fighting the Parthians. So the Persians, the Parthians, were very interested in the situation in Palestine, and that's what he means. But I think in my work I've discovered another person that I think is very important. Her name is Helen of Adiabene. And she's a convert to Judaism. Now, unfortunately, Josephus tells us nothing about her in the war. You have to read the Antiquities to get the information about her. And once again, the war sometimes is written too close to the events in question. Plus, he says it's translated from a previous work, which he did where, how, and why, in his native language for his Eastern brethren, meaning for the Jews of Mesopotamia. The Jewish community in Mesopotamia goes way back to the time of Babylonian captivity. So he wrote his original book for those people, and he seems to think that there was going to be a lot of support. So the theory is that one of the reasons he wrote this book was to discourage the people of Mesopotamia from trying to counter Roman power in this part of the world. And that he was, to some extent, not put up to it, but he was doing a service also to his patrons by writing the original book and circulating it in the East originally among his co-religionists in the Babylonian, Mesopotamian culture sphere that he says that he did. Now let's go back to Queen Helen. She's mentioned, if you have time, you could look at book 20 of the Antiquities, which is the last book of the Antiquities. The Antiquities can be found in collections like this. And it only goes up to the period right before the war. It doesn't go into the war. And it ends with a recitation of all the priests from the time of David up to the time of the uprising against Rome, the last priests of Jerusalem, as they're called. In that chapter 20, we not only have the story of Queen Helen's conversion to Judaism told, but we also have James's death given to us, which we don't have in the war. James, the brother of Jesus' death, is described, and things of that. So the book 20 of the Antiquities is really extremely important. We have the famine discussed that Acts refers to. We have the Udis mentioned, who is not mentioned in the Jewish war. So if you ever have time, I would recommend reading book 18, 19, and 20 of the Antiquities. That'll fill you in with all the missing pieces, because 18 has the John the Baptist material that we don't have in the Jewish war. And 19 has some more stuff about Herodian family relations and things like that, which is very, very detailed. Why is the conversion of Queen Helen? Because as we see in the Jewish war, some of her either immediate family members or offspring died in the first engagement of the war against the Romans. Some careful reading of Josephus, and not just the war, which actually, the detail of the war is unnecessary for you, but the material in books 18, 19, and 20 of the Antiquities is fundamental. If you want to go back to 16, 17, okay, too. 16 will cover the Maccabee period again. I think the description of the sects also is in book 18 as well. So Queen Helen, I think that's what he's implying, that she had money, she financed it, she helped. Because I mentioned earlier the Arch of Titus, what's inscribed on the Arch of, oh, it's right in the front of your book, there it is. What's that thing they're carrying? 7-branch candelabra. That was given to the temple by Queen Helen. It was of pure gold. And they took that, of course, that was one of their greatest prizes. She had given it to the temple as a gift. So this is in the 40s. In Christian texts, she's a convert to Christianity, which is really, really interesting. So if you read Eusebius, she converts to Christianity somewhat. So it's really, what form of Judaism did she actually convert to? I think, in my own perverted and prejudiced way, that she converted to a kind of Jamesian form of Judaism. Because she takes, and even in the rabbinic literature, 3 Nazarite oaths. And apparently it must have to do with being a suspected adulteress, because I think it's either Josephus or the Talmud or both say, if you look in my notes you'll find it, that she paid for a plaque to be put up in the temple with the suspected adulteress text on it from the book of Leviticus, which means that you shouldn't make accusations against an adulteress that you can't back up. So to my mind, she wouldn't have had that put up in gold leaf on the wall of the temple if there hadn't been a problem concerning it, don't you think? So there was some issue about suspected adultery that had surfaced relating to her. So she's a very interesting character. And I think that's, why am I calling, that's I think is, her sons, or her relatives participated in the uprising. She's famed in Josephus and Antiquities of having helped relieve the famine, of sending her famine relief agents or treasury agents, along with a son of hers that later became king, called Azat. And she seems to have been involved with another king in northern Syria who Christian legends say converted to Christianity. He was called King Agbarus, or Abgar. This is really getting into really specialized information. And those people had big harems, those kings, and they did have eunuchs. I think that the euphemism of being eunuchs is the way Romans looked upon circumcision, because Helen's children decided, it's a long story, enough to read Josephus, I didn't want to get into it, decided to circumcise themselves when they converted, and Helen was against it. It's all in Josephus. Okay, I'm just talking about where the money came from and who I think was encouraging this. Again, look, I'm not trying to say I'm some sort of superhuman genius of some kind, but I'm astonished that none of this stuff is ever covered in any textbook I ever see. And, you know, these are the fine points. So how can the public ever really get any in-depth understanding when we come to a class at Cal State Long Beach and you're not even having a class dealing with these materials at Harvard or Oxford or someplace? It's very sad in a way, I think. And these are the things you really need to know to get into this period. And there's a great opening in this field. On the other hand, because there are so many people who are dominating it, who have such a superficial attitude towards it, the opportunities aren't as great as you might think, because they are not willing to entertain competition in this field either. So they dominate all the positions and the appointments and the publications and a lot of everything else that goes on in this field. So it isn't an easy nut to crack. And I've been fortunate to have made as much progress as I personally have teaching here at Cal State Long Beach. Anyway, vast resource of men and money, and so widespread was the ferment, and the Jews expected their Mesopotamian brethren to intervene. Yeah, they thought that probably the Persians were going to come and help them. Roman supremacy was being challenged everywhere. After Nero's death, disorder reigned everywhere. He was killed in 68 in the middle of this affair. Of course, it's my view, expressed in all my books, that Nero deliberately provoked this affair. Just like the fire in Rome was blamed on the Christians by him, whoever he meant by Christians. I'm not sure he didn't mean messiness. I don't think that people knew the difference between a messinist and a Pauline Christian at this time. Ones with Roman citizenships like Paul, or others who were more, you read, take John the Baptist as he's portrayed at his words, the fire is in the fan, the chaff is ready for the burning. I am sure that there were groups that were ready to put things to the torch. And were not like Paul, who loved the Roman Empire and he loved his citizenship. But there were other people who were much more aggressive who were involved in this and saw Rome as the great Satan, or as it's put in the Apocalypse, Babylon. Babylon is fallen, the whore of Babylon. So that's a symbol supposedly for Rome, and I think revolutionaries could have caused the fire in Rome. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they did. Nero would have called these revolutionaries Christians. Nero would not have distinguished between Jews and Christians. Nero had Christians, in fact, in his entourage. Paul sends Epaphroditus to Nero's entourage. It is in Philippians. I've told you about that at the end of Philippians. He said, I'm sending to you my colleague and fellow soldier Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus is a secretary for Greek letters in Nero's entourage, and later helps Nero commit suicide. And this seems to be the same person that Paul is involved with. It's a very, very, very odd situation, and I still haven't sorted it all out. But you won't read this in any book, unfortunately, because people just don't dig that deep. They just want to leave the show the way it is, but I prefer not to. In any case, Epaphroditus is Josephus' publisher. He dedicates the Antiquities to him. He talks about him in the Vita, his autobiography that he prefaces to the Antiquities. And Epaphroditus is blamed by Domitian 20 years later at having raised his hand against an emperor. And therefore Domitian executes him. Not that Domitian cared about Epaphroditus or about Nero. He was upset about Epaphroditus. I think the reason had to do with Josephus' works and maybe some Christian tendencies on the part of Epaphroditus. If he was a colleague of Paul, and I'm sure he had Christian tendencies, Pauline Christian tendencies. Now Domitian was killed by other secret Christians in the imperial entourage. People who later were responsible for writing the literature we call the Clementines. Now, I think Clement is this person, Flavius Clemens, who was in the royal family and was supposed to maybe succeed Titus or Domitian, but because of his Christian tendencies, he was executed by Domitian. Then his sister or wife, called Flavia Domitilla, these are all Flavians, you see. Her slave or freedman called Stephen then assassinated Domitian. So I think that Domitian was assassinated in retribution for having killed Flavius Clemens and others, even perhaps Josephus and Epaphroditus. Let's get out of this here, let's get moving. I therefore thought it inexcusable which issues which were involved to see truth misrepresented and to take no notice. Parthians, Babylonians, remotest Arabians, Babylonian Jews, Assyrians, all these peoples, you see, thanks to my labors, were accurately informed of the causes of the war, the sufferings involved, and its disastrous ending. So they were told what it means to revolt against Rome. I will state the facts accurately and impartially. Well, sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. At the same time, the language in which I record the events will reflect my own feelings. Now listen to this mea culpa of the kind you get in the Gospel of Matthew. For I must permit myself to bewail, like at the Wailing Wall, the tragedy of my country. She was destroyed by internal dissensions. Now he hates the revolutionaries and the insurrectionists, and the Romans. Listen to this: who so unwillingly set fire to the temple. But as usual, just like Christ is the temple, they did it unwillingly. They were pushed to it by the Jews. You see, there's always a parallel there, and you should always be aware of it. Sometimes it's not easy to see. Then anyway, they were brought in by the Jews' self-appointed rulers. No, that's not true, because the leaders do invite the Romans into the city, but they're not the self-appointed leaders, they're the Roman puppet leaders who asked the Romans to come down in and put down the uprising. The popular sentiment is on the side of the revolutionaries, so how can you say these are the Jews' self-appointed leaders? These are the leaders that were imposed upon them by foreign power. Who's the intermediary between this group of, shall we say, turncoat Jews in the city and the Roman forces outside the city? Someone called Saulus. He is the person who takes the message to the Roman forces in 66 AD to come into the city on the part of the peace party in Jerusalem. How do I know? Well, to Josephus. Who is this Saul? Who is this Saulus? Who is he? And later he goes to Rome. Josephus tells us he appeals to Rome because he runs into some trouble after that in the Roman camp, and he goes to take his case to Nero on an appeal to Nero. And he goes and he sees Nero and delivers his report to Nero in Corinth. And then all this is in my James' book, and he's heard of no more. That was 66 AD. Anyway, look at Titus. And Titus Caesar, he admits, the temple's destroyer. He testified to this. He said that I was brought in by the Jews' own leaders. And throughout the war, he pitied the common people who were helpless against the partisans. Interesting enough, the term he uses, the same term that the Gospels use, Greek lestai, who are the two others crucified by next to Jesus. In the Gospels, the translation in English is thieves, but it's the same word as here, bandits, thugs and bandits. So these are not just thieves, these are insurrectionary, violent people.
In the NIV, we're thinking about Mark, it actually wasn't inserted.
Yeah, that's right. You see thieves, they are inserted. And then, of course, he goes into the biggest thing, that we brought all our misfortunes on ourselves. His blood be upon us in perpetuity. You know, this is the mea culpa thing that goes into the Matthew presentation to some extent of the Jews. Don't forget, Josephus' father is who? A priest called Matthew. A priest who wrote. He says his father was a known writer. I have a feeling there's something there. I'm not the only one who thinks that. Other writers have thought that, but nobody can pull it together any further than I've just suggested. Okay, I'll have a 15-minute break. All right, let's see what Josephus can tell us about things we don't already know from the Maccabee books, because he basically follows in this discussion. Now, I tell you, in the Antiquities, he covers all this material again. Like in the Antiquities, he allows that Judas was elected to the high priesthood 2 or 3 times by the people. And he doesn't say that here in the Jewish War, and Maccabees 1 doesn't say that. And he basically is following Maccabees 1, isn't he? For instance, here. He starts with who again? You must be familiar with him by now. Who was disputing the control with the Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy VI. Dissension broke out among the leading Jews. Onias was the chief of the priests. And of course, he does have Onias in Maccabees 2, so we don't, he isn't totally following Maccabees 1 here. In any case, many of the, we see that this is part of the struggle between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and the king was implored to invade Judea by some turncoat people called the sons of Tobias. We didn't hear about them in the Maccabee books, really. Anyway, this high priest Onias is different from the one that Antiochus Epiphanes executed. This is one who flees to Egypt, to the district of Heliopolis, and then built another little town similar to Jerusalem there, and a temple. So there was another temple in Egypt that was built in the wake of these struggles here, because I guess of the danger of things in Jerusalem and Palestine Central. And he, at the end of the war, he's very complete. He goes and follows the Romans down to that temple too, and has the Romans destroy that temple. So this is really a whole. He begins with that temple in Egypt, but ends with its destruction, including the one in Jerusalem, but also the one in Egypt. Okay, so he captured the city, and then Mattathias, son of Hasmonean, that's where you get the term Hasmoneans, a priest from the village of Modi'in, raised a force consisting of his 5 sons and himself. So now he's following Maccabees 1, right? And defeated Antiochus' generals, chased them out of Judea. So far we know all of this. In gratitude for his expulsion of the foreigners, his countrymen gladly accepted his rule. So according to Josephus, his rule was popular, and it was basically a rule by acclamation or election. And he says Judas was the eldest of his sons. Was Judas the eldest of his sons in the Maccabee books? I don't think he was. I think it was Simon was the eldest, wasn't he? So Matthias was already a fighting priest, and Judas continues this tradition of a battle priest, if you want to call it that. Antiochus Epiphanes returned. Judas counterattacked, took possession of the temple, cleansed the whole area, walled it around, ordered new ceremonial vessels in place of the old defiled ones, and resumed the sacrifice. So all that we've had in Daniel, Maccabees, and now Josephus, right? Antiochus died at that point, and then another son by a similar name took over. Now, there were some more engagements, and one of the brothers, called Eleazar, Judas's brother, went under the tallest elephant. They had elephants on their side at this point, and stabbed it, and he was crushed by it. That's in the Maccabees 1. And he put glory before life. That's the first of these martyrdom. Many Jews flocked to Judas's standard, but he lost his own life too. And then another brother, did we hear about this other brother, John? Fell victim to a plot of the pro-Syrians. So there's another brother, John. So we have a John, a Judas, a Jonathan, a Simon. They're all the names of the Christian apostles and companions, followers of Jesus. Was John mentioned in the Maccabee books? Huh? He was? He died pretty quick, did he? Okay. I'll take your word. I'm sure it is, because this is not very original here with Josephus. So he obviously knows Maccabees 1, wouldn't you say? He doesn't know Maccabees 2, clearly. He hasn't read that other book that Maccabees 2 is based on. At least he doesn't show any knowledge of that kind. He doesn't know all that pre-party strife before all this. And he doesn't think as highly of Judas as Maccabees 2 does. So Jonathan succeeds John, and he gets some treaty of friendship with Rome. That's in the Maccabee books. And then he was treacherously seized and imprisoned, and I guess he was executed. Simon campaigned against this person who seized him, and then that caused the murder of Jonathan. So he covers about 30 years of Maccabean history in about 3 paragraphs here, right? A little more detailed in the Antiquities. Simon's conduct of affairs was most efficient, and then he tells about his conquest and so on. And he also had a big victory here. And it's he that was appointed high priest. And he gave, after 170 years of Macedonian control, the Jews their freedom. So he gives Simon the big credit for everything, right? But in the Antiquities, he said Judas was elected to the high priesthood on at least 2 occasions, I think. Why do I care? The idea that in scroll studies of the Maccabeans are in some sense by a lot of scholars considered the wicked priests. I don't think there's any indication in the literature of that feeling about them by anybody. So I just don't think that the scroll people are reflecting their own feelings about the Maccabees. Most of the Christian scholars who don't have a high opinion of Jewish priests like the Maccabees, and the rabbis don't have a very high opinion of them either. But I think the people at that time did. And I think that they were beloved and respected. Certainly, I don't think Josephus shows any embarrassment at being descended from them in his autobiography. He says he's a descendant to some extent. Anyway, he was assassinated at a banquet. Here's where they get that banquet at Simon. And John Hyrcanus was saved. John Hyrcanus being the next generation. And he too had the high priesthood like his father before him. So the Maccabeans are certainly high priests. Are they kings? That is not clear yet. Although Jonathan in the Maccabee books wore the purple of the king. I think that they are basically priest-kings, though they're not officially kings yet until they have total independence. John, he says, was very successful. And this success aroused hostility in their fellow countrymen, though I don't understand why. Anyway, John lived for 33 years as king and priest, so his administration was, so we're really moving down. We started this whole thing around 167 BC, and we're almost down to about 100 BC. But he says he was a very blessed person. He had 5 sons. There was no cause to blame him. He enjoyed the 3 greatest privileges at once: political power, high priesthood, and prophecy. He was constantly under divine inspiration, so no future event was hidden from him. He foretold that his 2 elder sons would not control the state. So for him, prophecy is simply a matter of foretelling the future. And that's to some extent how it's used in the New Testament in the book of Acts. The prophets and teachers of the early church. They're not really big-time prophets. They're just like fortune tellers or something like that. Josephus pawns himself off as a prophet. But, so that's enough. By this time, prophecy has deteriorated to simply being able to foresee the future. Their father died. The eldest of them, Aristobulus, turned the constitution into a monarchy. So he says he was the first to wear the crown, as well as the high priesthood. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if the crown wasn't already being worn by Jonathan before him. But these were all whose sons? Simon and then John, Hyrcanus. And then we're in the 3rd generation, Aristobulus. We're going to get another Aristobulus in the next generation. So we're going to have a lot of, this is Aristobulus 1, if you want to call it. And then another brother, Antigonus. They're having Greek names, you see. And Aristobulus' Hebrew name would be Judas. We know because we have grave remains that show Judas Aristobulus and things like that. So just like some of the apostles, we get double names. By this time we're getting Greek and Hebrew names. And the Maccabees are being Greekified to some extent, Hellenized if you will. So then we have some squabbling between them. Some cruelty. He let his mother die of starvation in a dungeon. Vengeance overtook him at the loss of his brother Antigonus, whom he was very fond. He says that he was the first to wear the crown 471 years, 3 months after the return of the nation to their own land. And my note says he's got much too, he's about 40 years too much here. So their idea of time and dates are very, very poor even. So the point is that the scrolls talk about dates, and I think the scrolls speak about 490 years or something like that after Nebuchadnezzar, and that doesn't mean that they know exactly that that's the date that we would think it is. And we'll look at that. Remember here's a date that is out of whack, and there are other dates. When he lists the high priest at the end of the Antiquities, his dates are totally out of whack. He doesn't understand how long the period from the Babylonian invasion to the present time is at all. And the Talmud is no better. So we have some problems, some disputing here between these brothers. And anyway, Judas, an Essene born and bred, was never wrong in any of his predictions. So Judas is another of these pseudo-prophets, and he mostly portrays Essenes as hanging around the temple, giving flattering prophecies of different kinds. And that certainly doesn't look like what the Dead Sea Scrolls are all about. But that is the first mention of an Essene. He might mean Hasid here, a pious one, if Essene comes from Hasid. He doesn't mention the Hasidians, notice here. And he wants to show that he had made a prophecy, even though it looked like he was wrong, he wasn't wrong. So there was another brother now, Alexander. His widow released his brothers and enthroned Alexander the eldest. This may be some idea of levirate marriage. 2 brothers squabble, right? Aristobulus and Antigonus. But there's a 3rd brother, Alexander, and he has a nickname. And he's the one who finally emerges as the next generation significant personality. So we have here several generations already in Maccabees. We have Judas. We have Mattathias. So let's say circa 170. Let's say 160. Then we have Jonathan, I don't know if my dates are exactly right, let's say 150. Simon, I'm just giving round numbers here, 140. Then Simon, all the rest are Simon's descendants, right? And so the next generation there is John, what's his name? Hyrcanus. And he reigns almost 40 years, so he goes down to almost 100. 110 maybe. I don't know if I've got my dates right. Let's just say 110 BC. And then he has some sons who squabble with each other. And there's Aristobulus, who we just mentioned. That would be Aristobulus 1. He doesn't survive. Antigonus. He's got one kills the other or whatever. In any case, the one who's important is Alexander. And he's going to bring us down to about 75. Alexander Unitas. So the interesting events start with Alexander Unitas. On ascending the throne, he executed one brother as a rival claimant. These guys were not too kind. And the last one kept out of the public eye, so he didn't give him any trouble. Then there's more warfare going on here, and he does some capturing. And some more seditions going on. He gives a lot of battle material here. Now, is Josephus getting this from his own memory? He's taking it from someone else's work. He gives you his sources occasionally. One of the people who's a source of his is an Herodian diplomat called Nicolaus of Damascus. That was a work that was obviously done in Rome, in Greek, by someone who was in the Herodian entourage. So he would probably be getting most of this material from him and a few other. He also mentioned Strabo of Cappadocia, the Greek geographer. Those are two of his sources he mentions. So this is now stuff from sources here. And it's only as good as his source. I don't think he's doing much editing here. And this is where Demetrius comes in, who's now the Seleucid present claimant to the Seleucid throne, right? Demetrius, the victor, was deserted by those who he'd called in. Anyway, he's coming into the country. But some of the Jews prefer Demetrius to Alexander. Here's where you get some disaffection from the Maccabees. And Alexander isn't that popular because he seems to be pretty cruel, pretty violent. He executes one of his rival brothers and so on. Demetrius was invited into the country. And Alexander fled to the hills and was joined by 6,000 Jews. He had 6,000 partisans, sort of like where the Dead Sea Scrolls may have been found. And then, because the people preferred Alexander to foreign rule is what it comes down to. And therefore Demetrius, convinced that Alexander was strong enough to take the field against him, withdrew. So the people, when the chips were down, whose side did they take? Alexander's, even though they were not happy about some of the things he did. The people are freedom-oriented and nationalist. So Alexander was really angry at the turncoats who invited the foreigners into the country, right? So what does he do? He proceeded in his impiety to take 800 of his opponents and basically hang them up alive, impale them, if you prefer Roman language, crucify them. Though it isn't an actual crucifixion, it's more like an impalement or something. But for the Jews, crucifixion, as Paul describes in Galatians, is really hanging upon a tree, they call it. So this is kind of like hanging upon a tree. 8,000 others he exiled. So he was pretty ferocious in his rage, in his vindictiveness. But what generation of Maccabees are we already in? We're in the 4th generation of Maccabees, aren't we? Now listen. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls speaks about Demetrius, and there seems to be part of the word missing. not a complete text. It's got fragments. And it speaks about Demetrius, king of the Greeks. And then a furious young lion who hung people up alive at the time Demetrius came into the country. A thing, it says, never before done in Israel, that it was forbidden to hang people up alive in that way. And it is in the book of Leviticus. It's forbidden. If you want to know what text that is, it's called the Nahum Pesher. Passages, like in Christianity, are taken out of context and analyzed in terms of contemporary events. Why were we so interested in the Kettim? Because the big argument in scroll studies is whether the Kettim are the Greeks or the Romans. And this Nahum commentary says that the Kettim come after the Greeks. But then you'll ask, well, why, if they're talking about the Kettim coming after the Greeks, are they talking about Demetrius and the furious young lion who hung many people up alive? A thing not done before in Israel. Because the text is only citing these things as examples of things that it doesn't like. It doesn't like crucifixion. It calls the people who were hung up the seekers after smooth things. So, you see, this is a very important episode for understanding the Dead Sea Scroll, isn't it? The seekers after smooth things are the Pharisees. And the Nahum Pesher does not like the Pharisees. And even though it's talking about how bad these Pharisees are, it doesn't approve of the furious young lion having done this. But the text is not otherwise hostile to the furious young lion. And what it's doing is it will not overtly identify the present, though it will identify people in the past. It employs an infuriating code. It calls people the wicked priest, the righteous teacher, the spouter of lying, but doesn't say who they are. But in the past, Demetrius, it'll say. Which, of course, makes Dead Sea Scroll studies open to any interpretation you want to give it. Now, scroll people say, oh, well, that shows scrolls are written at the time of Alexander Unitas. But I don't think it shows that at all. It only shows that they know as much about the past as Josephus knows about the past. And that they're willing to give this example from the past to illustrate a situation in the present. That is, when crucifixion was being done so promiscuously by the Romans. Let's see how we can determine that these people are Pharisees that he's hung up here. Because it doesn't say yet, it hasn't mentioned Pharisees, right? So on and so forth. Demetrius was accused of many crimes, and then he left Judea, and he died in the midst of storm and stress. Oh, Alexander died after having reigned 27 years, after all this fighting was going on. And he left the throne to his wife Alexandra. Now, was that Alexandra, had she previously been his brother's wife, the one that was killed in the beginning of all this thing? You'd have to look at the antiquities. I think she was, but the point is, she survives it. He left the throne to his wife Alexandra. And she, unlike him, she gained the goodwill of the people, and she had a reputation for piety. He had too many excesses. She was very particular in observance of national custom, meaning the law. And she turned out people who didn't observe the law out of office. And she had two sons. The oldest was Hyrcanus. The youngest was Aristobulus. Here we have the repetition name. This would be Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Now Hyrcanus, she appointed the high priest because he was the older and he didn't interfere much in affairs. The younger was more impetuous, as younger brothers often are, and therefore she tried to keep him out of the public eye. But alongside her was the growing power of the Pharisees. So now the Pharisees are beginning to show themselves. I told you that I thought the birth moment of the Pharisees was way back at that time when we got the two groups of Hasmoneans, one more zealous, another more compromised. Here the Pharisees are already a known group, and he says they were more pious than the rest, so here they are like Hasids, you see, more like Hasideans. But what kind of Hasideans? You see here, the Pharisees here again supported the entrance of Demetrius, the foreign ruler, into the country against the Maccabean ruler. So they are not nationalists in the same way that the supporters of the Maccabees are. You follow me? And they were not nationalists back then in the Maccabees episode when they allowed the high priest appointed by the Seleucids, Alchemus, to come in and they went over to him. So they are a kind of Hasidian, but not the uncompromising Hasidians. So she was basically under the control of the Pharisees. While she ruled others, the Pharisees ruled her. What about her son Aristobulus? You think he's a Pharisee? No. He's very nationalistic, quite resistance-minded, and not willing to take kindly to foreign power or foreign control. So you see, he then says, thus Diogenes, an eminent man who had been a friend of her husband Alexander, was put to death by them on the charge of having embedded the king in impaling 800 citizens. So now we're back to that problem of what the king did in hanging people up alive. They then pressed Alexander to execute the rest of those who had incited Alexander against them. So it is quite clear that they supported the people who Alexander had taken vengeance upon. By implication, Pharisees. Now the Dead Sea Scrolls are against the people that were hung up alive, but they don't like them anyway. They don't agree with them. And they, I think, are the Pharisees. So Hyrcanus is basically on his mother's side, on the side of the Pharisees. Aristobulus seized his chance, and with numerous of his followers devoted to him because of his impulsive character, charismatic character, I should say. He's got charisma. The other guy's a dullard, his older brother. Got all the strongholds or fortresses into his power and claimed to be king, took the kingship. Hyrcanus got very upset, that's his brother. He locked up the children of Aristobulus in this fortress in the temple area, which later was renamed for Mark Antony as Antonia. But before Alexandra could do anything, she died after ruling the country for 9 years. So we're about 70 BC, here we are now. So Hyrcanus was the legitimate heir because Alexandra had appointed him king. But he was no match for his brother Aristobulus in ability. The two met in battle, and the bulk of Hyrcanus' army, what happened? Deserted and went over to Aristobulus. So, who's the popular leader? Are the Pharisees the popular party? No. Time and time again, they are not. They like to pretend they are. And the rabbis of today's Judaism like to pretend they are because they are descendants of the Pharisees. But we see in these events, over and over again, the people support the more impulsive nationalist leader. Judas, Alexander Unias, and now Aristobulus. Hyrcanus is not happy with that. Fear seized the enemies of Aristobulus when he so unexpectedly triumphed. And here we get the introduction of whom? Herod's father. Most of all, Antipater, who he had long detested. He was by race or nationality an Idumean. He was not a Hebrew or a Jew. He was an Idumean, and he had wealth and ancestry and other sources. Made him a natural leader of his nation, the Idumeans, but not of the Jews. Herod was not Jewish. He was a king appointed over the Jews by the Romans. That is, he became a king of the Jews, but he was not a Jewish king. The legitimate kings at this point are the Maccabees. So he becomes Hyrcanus' advisor. And he has relations to the king of Petra, or what is called here the king of Arabia, Arabia Petra, across Jordan, down near the Sea of Aqaba Gulf, Red Sea. Aretas, the king of Arabia. Later on, Aretas, and they're all called Aretas, every one of these kings in this line from Petra. These are Arabian Arab kings. And it looks like the Herod's mother was someone from Petra. So he was an Idumean Arab. And this is another thing that I have against the Gospels, if you don't mind my saying. They make it look like the king of the Jews is Herod, and that he's someone that the Jews approve of and are, prepared to have as their king. No, they're not. The people hate them. They don't like them. They never did like them. They don't want them. And they spent 250 years struggling against them. So again, the writers of the Gospels are misleading people. And none of the decisions taken by any Herodian king is representative of the Jewish people at this time. The Herods owe their position to one fact and one fact only, the Romans, the Roman power. They are representatives of the Roman government, and they have nothing to do with Jews at all. And what happens is that Herod's father gets Roman citizenship in perpetuity, and Josephus will tell you about that, for the services that he renders Rome, and then he carves himself out a kingship on the back of, he's the first Roman governor of this province. And he manages to insinuate his children into a kingship. So he goes to Aretas, Hyrcanus does, and he heaps abuse on Aristobulus. Antipater does, Herod's father. And he gets Hyrcanus safely smuggled out of Jerusalem to Petra, Aretas' capital. But it's the capital of Arabia at this time. This is called Arabia. These are called Arabs. Arabs are known by this time. These are Arab peoples. So what happens is at that time, Pompey, the Great, is coming down through Asia Minor and Syria in his conquest in the east, while Caesar is in the west in Gaul. The time is around 63 BC. We're in the middle of a squabble of two brothers. The nationalist one has taken power by more or less popular support. Pompey's lieutenant is called Scaurus. There is one scroll document that seems to mention Scaurus. Again, it looks like it's an old document that is in the archives of this group. From one of the newly published ones. In any case, he said it condemns Scaurus. It's against Scaurus. Anyway, he comes in the country, and Antipater conciliates him, and he tells Hyrcanus to present himself to Pompey, or Pompey's advance lieutenant, Scaurus. The text that comes on speaks about Aemilius. He's called Aemilius Scaurus. Pompey entered Syria and arrived at Damascus, and Hyrcanus and Antipater run up to try to get his help. And Aristobulus did likewise, knowing that Scaurus could be bribed. So he too presented himself, decked out in his royal splendor or royal purple, whatever garments that color was. And here's the key passage to my mind of this whole series of events in Josephus. He turned sick of servility and could not bear to debase himself in order to secure his ends at the cost of his dignity. And so he turned back. He would not do a Josephus. He would not do a Rabbi Yochanan. He would not humiliate himself before foreign power. My definition of Pharisees is taken from this kind of situation. To me, not how the Pharisees see themselves as arguing over small points of law. I see them as willing to make accommodation to foreign power. And the other group, not. Or not as much. Maybe Aristobulus a little bit, but not his supporters. Anyway, Aristobulus withdrew to the city, and finally he does go and meet Pompey, and they take him prisoner. So Pompey has Aristobulus prisoner. He's coming into the country. He's in Jericho. The supporters of Aristobulus are calling for war to rescue the king. Hyrcanus's followers are doing what? Recommending opening the gates to Pompey. Later on, in 37 BC, this is 63 BC, the Pharisee leaders will recommend to the people, open the gates to Herod. In 66 AD, the Pharisees will invite the Roman armies into the city to put down the uprising. Josephus calls himself a Pharisee. He's a good example of one. But are the people Pharisees? Are the Pharisees the popular party that everyone assumes? Do the people ever take the Pharisees' advice? Never. They always do the opposite. So in what sense are the Pharisees the popular party? I say they are not the popular party. The popular party are a group of nationalist, purist, Judas Maccabee, zealot-style resistance people. And how do I know this? It's not written in any book. I see it from the text. Right? Okay. What happens here? They don't do this. So they have a struggle, and the resistance party retires into the temple and prepare to do what? Fight to the death, as recommended by what books? The Maccabee books. Make a pious end. Am I wrong here? And they certainly do. What do the others do, the Pharisees? They invite the Romans into the city. The time is 63 BC. We could get more of this description in the Antiquities if you want, but there's sufficient here to get it here. So the Zealots, the Proto-Zealots, the Nationalists, whatever we want to call them, the Zadokites, the Hasmonean, resistance-minded Hasmoneans, all those, whatever group, I don't know where you would put Essenes at the moment, but I think Essenes are part of this group. Pompey was on the northern side of the city, filling in the trench. And he didn't even try to avail himself of the seventh day, because Jews only will fight in defense on the seventh day. In any case, it was a bad siege, and the Romans were suffering severely. Pompey, however, was amazed at the unshakable endurance of the Jews. And listen to this. Especially how they maintained their religious ceremony in the midst of a storm of missiles, just as if a deep peace had folded the cities, the daily sacrifices and the offerings for the dead, as recommended by 2 Maccabees. Well, what are these? These are zealot priests serving God, and who put the service to God before their own lives. And not even when the temple was being captured and they were being butchered around the altar did they abandon the ceremonies. What priests are these? Are these the Sadducees of the New Testament? No, you can bet your life they aren't. These are Maccabean type Sadducees, what I was calling purist Sadducees, pure Zadokite Hasmoneans. Many of the priests, though they saw the enemy approaching sword in hand, quietly went on with their sacred rites, cut down as they poured libations and offered incense, putting the service to God before their own preservation. But, and here's another interesting thing, most who fell were killed by their own countrymen of the rival faction. That is, the Pharisees cooperated with the Romans in the slaughter and killed all these priests when they could. Others beyond number threw themselves over the precipice. Some, maddened by their hopeless position, fired the buildings around the wall, perished in the flames. The Jews lost over 12,000 dead. The Romans lost so few it wouldn't hardly matter. But one thing that happened that was terrifying to them all. The holy place was forbidden for foreigners to enter. But Pompey and his staff went into the inner sanctum, clearly of the temple, in which no one was permitted to enter except the high priest, to see what it contained. And he saw their libation cups, lamps, spices, the sacred money totaling 2 million pounds. But he didn't lay a finger on any of it. He didn't take any booty. He only desecrated the temple by looking inside to see what was there. He was afraid of the gods, if you want. Neither this nor any other of the sacred treasures he lay a finger. Only one day after the capture, he instructed the custodians to purify the temple, perform the normal sacrifice. He appointed Hyrcanus high priest, because he and his people had helped in the siege. And they held off the crowds of country folk anxious to fight for Aristobulus. Aristobulus is clearly the popular leader. I proved that case, haven't I? So he proved his worth. And the prisoners, including Aristobulus' father-in-law, the chief authors of the war, were beheaded. Faustus and the men who had given him such splendid support received magnificent rewards, and the whole country was laid under tribute. So Aristobulus and his family were taken to Rome by Pompey, and there was 2 sons, 2 daughters. One son, Alexander, escaped en route. The younger Antigonus and his sisters were taken to Rome. Scaurus, meanwhile, went on to invade Arabia. This son, Alexander of Aristobulus, in time collected a large force, undermined Hyrcanus' position in Judea. Mark Antony, who had been in the siege with Pompey, now he was sent by a man named Gabinius, the next Roman commander, and he came in and made contact with Alexander, that is military contact. He killed a large number. In this battle, Mark Antony displayed his superlative courage. Gabinius next reinstated Hyrcanus in Jerusalem, entrusting him with the custody of the temple, set up a political system based on aristocracy. So he changed the situation, and soon trouble began again. Aristobulus escaped from Rome and rallied a number of Jews. So we're getting a constant situation here of upset and revolution.